I'm not the kind of person who likes being told what to do. I've always valued my independence, and for the most part, I've built a life that lets me enjoy it. I'm in my late 30s, a remote software developer with a knack for problem solving and a preference for working in peace. My life revolves around my home, my work, and my dogs. My 3 companions, 2 Dobermans and a German Shepherd, are more than just pets. They're my family, my protectors, and, admittedly, my daily dose of chaos. Each of them has such a distinct personality that it's like living with a pack of quirky furry roommates. One of them is the guardian, always alert and protective, like an ever-vigilant sentinel. Another is the clown whose goofy antics, like barking at his own reflection or proudly parading around with a stolen sock, never fail to make me laugh. Then there's the loyal one, the shadow who's constantly by my side, following me from room to room and curling up at my feet when I work. Together, we've built a little haven of routine, joy, and comfort in a world that often feels too noisy and overwhelming. But my life isn't just about the dogs. There's someone else who's just as important. My girlfriend. She doesn't live with me full-time, but she's here so often that it feels like she does. We've been together for a few years, and she's everything I didn't know I needed. She's the kind of person who lights up a room without even trying, who's as kind and loving as she is strong and opinionated. She's the one who calms me when I'm spiraling, who keeps me grounded when I get lost in my own head. We met at a mutual friend's party about 4 years ago. I wasn't planning to go. I was busy with work and honestly didn't feel like making small talk with strangers. But my friend convinced me, saying I needed to get out of my cave for once. I wasn't expecting much, but when she walked in, everything changed. She had this way of laughing, like she wasn't just hearing a joke but really feeling it. We ended up talking for hours that night. By the end of the party, I felt like I'd known her my whole life. She fit into my world effortlessly. She didn't just tolerate my dogs. She loved them. She got to know all their quirks and habits, even going so far as to spoil them with new toys and homemade treats. And it wasn't just the dogs she took care of, it was me too. She'd remind me to take breaks when I got too absorbed in work, make me tea when I stayed up late debugging some code, and nudge me out the door when she could tell I needed fresh air. I'd never had someone who looked out for me like that before. But then I almost lost her. About 8 months ago, I did something stupid, something I'll regret for the rest of my life. At the time, I didn't have the words to explain it, even to myself. I was restless, burned out, and feeling disconnected from everything, including her. Instead of talking to her about it, I bottled it all up, convincing myself I could handle it on my own. One night, while she was out of town visiting family, I went to a bar downtown. It wasn't a big plan. I just wanted to sit somewhere noisy, drink a beer, and distract myself from the knot of stress in my chest. That's where I met her. A stranger with a loud laugh and a boldness I wasn't prepared for. She approached me while I was sitting at the bar, made some joke about the game on TV, and before I knew it, we were talking. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just making conversation. But as the night went on, the line between harmless and stupid blurred. I didn't stop her when she leaned in closer, when her hand brushed mine. And I didn't stop myself when I kissed her outside the bar. It was quick and meaningless, and the second it was over, guilt hit me like a truck. I left immediately, went home, and sat on the couch in silence for hours, replaying the moment in my head and hating myself for it. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again, that it was a mistake I could bury and forget. But the guilt didn't go away. Every time I saw my girlfriend after that, it ate at me. She didn't deserve this. She deserved the truth. So I told her. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We were sitting on the couch one night, the dogs sprawled out at our feet, and I could barely look at her. My chest felt tight, and my palms were sweating, but I forced the words out. "I need to tell you something," I said. She turned to me, concerned. "What's wrong?" That look on her face made it even harder, but I owed it to her. I told her everything. The bar, the conversation, the kiss, and how much I hated myself for it afterward. I didn't try to make excuses. I just said I was sorry, over and over, and told her I understood if she couldn't forgive me. She didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Then she stood up, grabbed her coat, and left. I didn't stop her. I didn't know what to say. The next few weeks were hell. She wouldn't answer my calls or respond to my texts. I wrote her a letter, pouring my heart into every word, but she didn't reply. I thought I'd lost her for good. I spent my days going through the motions, taking care of the dogs, working, trying to keep myself distracted, but nothing helped. Every quiet moment was filled with the sound of her leaving, the look on her face as I told her the truth. Eventually, she agreed to talk. She came over one night, her expression guarded, and we sat at the kitchen table. I apologized again, told her how much I regretted what I'd done and how much she meant to me. She listened, and when I was done, she told me how much I'd hurt her, how much trust I'd broken. But then she said something I didn't expect. I don't know if I can forgive you right now, but I don't want to give up on us. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a chance. And I took it. Since then, we've been working on rebuilding what I broke. It hasn't been easy, and I don't expect it to be. Trust takes time, and I'm willing to do the work. I've been more open with her, more present. I make an effort every day to show her how much she means to me. We spend more time together now. It's not perfect, but it's real. And after everything, I'll take real over perfect any day. Life here is good, or at least it's getting there. Let me tell you about the property where I live, because it's at the center of everything that's happened. This land has been in my family for over 70 years. My grandparents bought it back in the 1950s when the area was nothing but farmland and woods. They wanted a quiet place to raise their kids, and they found it here. The original house was small but charming, surrounded by dense trees and open sky. Over time, as suburban sprawl crept closer and closer, our property remained untouched. It stood out, a stubborn piece of the past that refused to be swallowed up by the future. When my grandparents passed, the property was left to me. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The house was old, falling apart in some places, and the land itself was more maintenance than I was used to. But the history, the memories, the connection to my family, that all meant too much to let it go. So I moved in, determined to make it my own while preserving what it stood for. It didn't take long to realize that the house wasn't going to last forever. The roof leaked every time it rained. The plumbing made ominous noises whenever I turned on the water, and the foundation was cracked in more places than I could count. I patched what I could, but it was clear that a teardown was inevitable. The final decision came a few years ago, when the wooded area around the property was cleared to make way for a sprawling suburban development. At first, I hated the idea. Watching the trees disappear, hearing the sound of construction every morning. It felt like the world was closing in on me. But as the development took shape, I saw an opportunity. If the land around me was changing, I might as well change with it. The old house would go, and in its place I'd build something new. I worked with the township to make it happen. They had strict conditions: drainage pits to manage water flow, permits for every stage of construction, and an agreement to keep my plans environmentally friendly. It was a headache, but I followed every rule. And when the house was finally finished, it was worth it. The new house was modern but simple, with clean lines and large windows that let in natural light. It was exactly what I needed. A fresh start on land that still felt like home. The dogs loved it, especially the spacious yard, and so did my girlfriend. It was our little haven, tucked away from the chaos of the world. The development next to my property is everything my land isn't. Meticulously planned, uniform, and governed by a homeowners association. I hadn't paid much attention to it at first. The houses were all identical. Rows of beige boxes with perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. I heard the occasional horror story from residents about the HOA's strict rules. They had regulations about everything. The color of your front door, how many inches your grass could grow, even what types of cars you could park in your driveway. They were especially infamous for their bans on aggressive dog breeds. It didn't matter if your dog was the sweetest thing on four legs. If it was a Doberman, Rottweiler, or German Shepherd, it was forbidden. For the most part, I ignored the HOA. My property wasn't part of their jurisdiction. and I had no intention of ever letting that change. I figured as long as I stayed out of their way, they'd stay out of mine. Couldn't have been more wrong. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. The envelope was thick, with the HOA's logo stamped on the front. I opened it out of curiosity, thinking it might be some kind of welcome notice or an invitation to a neighborhood event. It wasn't. The letter claimed that I was in violation of the HOA's rules regarding aggressive dog breeds. According to their regulations, my Dobermans and German Shepherd were prohibited. The letter demanded that I remove the offending animals immediately and pay a fine of $1,000 for every week I failed to comply. It even included a detailed breakdown of how the fines would escalate over time. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely they'd sent it to the wrong address. My property wasn't part of their HOA. I wasn't bound by their rules. I tossed the letter on the counter and forgot about it. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't so easy to ignore. It was more formal, more aggressive. The fines had already begun to accrue, and the letter now threatened further action if I didn't comply. They were serious. I sent a response this time, explaining that my property wasn't part of their HOA and that their rules didn't apply to me. I even attached a copy of my deed, which clearly showed that my land was separate. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next letter was downright hostile. They claimed I owed over $3,200 in unpaid fines and stated that they were prepared to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay. They also hinted at the possibility of retroactively adding my land to the HOA through legal action. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How could they possibly think they had the right to do any of this? Things only got worse from there. Members of the HOA started filing complaints with the township. They accused me of noise violations, claiming my dogs barked excessively. They alleged that my drainage pits were causing flooding in their neighborhood. They even filed complaints about my home's design, saying it didn't meet zoning requirements. Each time, I had to deal with township officials and inspectors, but every complaint was dismissed as baseless. I'd followed every rule during construction. My dogs were well-trained. The HOA had no case, but the constant harassment was taking a toll. I spent hours on paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. My work started to suffer. Even my weekends with my girlfriend felt less relaxing, overshadowed by the stress of dealing with the HOA's nonsense. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness. I knew the HOA was determined to make my life miserable, but I didn't realize how far they were willing to go until the day they crossed the line. Literally. Started like any other day. I was working in my home office, headphones on, the dogs snoozing in their usual spots. The sun was pouring through the windows, and everything felt calm. That's when the barking started. Now, barking isn't unusual in my house. With 3 dogs, there's always some kind of commotion, whether it's the mail being delivered or a squirrel daring to step foot in the yard. But this was different. This wasn't the playful, half-hearted woofing they did when they wanted attention. This was full-on, aggressive barking. A warning. I pulled off my headphones and rushed to the window. Standing at the edge of my yard, right near the driveway, were 2 people I didn't recognize. They were dressed in business casual clothing, button-up shirts and slacks, and they were holding clipboards. One of them had a phone raised, clearly taking pictures of my property. My gut twisted. It was the HOA. I stormed downstairs, my dogs following close behind me, their barks reverberating off the walls. By the time I opened the front door, my Dobermans were ahead of me, sprinting toward the strangers. They weren't going to hurt anyone. They're well-trained, and they know their boundaries, but they're big, intimidating dogs. To someone who doesn't know them, they look terrifying. The HOA representatives froze for a second before panic set in. The one holding the clipboard dropped it and took off running. The other tried to follow but tripped over one of the landscaping rocks I'd put in near the driveway. She landed hard, scrambling to get back up while shouting something I couldn't quite make out. My Dobermans stopped just short of them, barking and circling like sentinels guarding their territory. I whistled sharply, and my dogs immediately backed off, retreating to my side. I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. "Can I help you?" I asked, though the anger bubbling under the surface was hard to mask. The woman who'd fallen brushed dirt off her knees and glared at me. "We're here to document the presence of your dogs for our records," she snapped, as if that explained everything. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. "This is private property. You have no right to be here. We're conducting an investigation on behalf of the HOA." The man stammered, clearly shaken. "Your dogs are in violation of our guidelines." "Let me stop you right there," I interrupted, stepping closer. "My property is not part of your HOA. Your guidelines don't apply to me, and if you ever set foot on my property again, I'll have you both arrested for trespassing. Do I make myself clear?" The woman opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. "Leave," I said sharply, pointing to the road. Now, they didn't need to be told twice. They hurried down the driveway, glancing nervously over their shoulders at my dogs, who were still watching them intently. Once they were gone, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from pure frustration. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an invasion of privacy, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That night, I started researching attorneys. If the HOA wanted a fight, I was going to make damn sure I was prepared. After a few phone calls and consultations, I found a lawyer who specialized in property law. We sat down together and I laid everything out, the letters, the fines, the threats, and now the trespassing incident. The lawyer was calm and methodical as he went through the details. "First things first," he said, "we need to confirm that no liens have been placed on your property. Given what you've told me, I don't think they have the authority to do that, but it's best to be sure." Thankfully, his research confirmed what I already suspected. There were no liens, and the HOA had no legal claim over my property. Next, we drafted a formal letter disputing the fines and asserting my independence. It was direct and to the point, outlining the fact that my property was outside their jurisdiction and warning them to cease any further attempts at enforcement. We also discussed the trespassing incident. While I hadn't called the police at the time, something I kind of regretted in hindsight, I had photos of their car parked on my driveway, as well as security footage from the cameras I'd installed around the house. My lawyer advised me to keep everything well documented in case the situation escalated further. He also suggested sending a cease and desist letter, which we did. On top of that, I took some practical steps to protect myself. I made sure the house was never left vacant for long periods of time. I didn't want to give them any opportunity to interfere while I wasn't home. I updated all of my dogs' licenses, vaccinations, and vet records, ensuring I was in full compliance with local regulations. If they were going to keep harassing me, I wasn't going to give them a single inch to stand on. A few weeks later, things took an unexpected turn. My lawyer received a letter from the HOA's attorneys, and it was clear they'd finally done their homework. According to the letter, a review of township records had confirmed that my property was never part of their jurisdiction. The HOA had based all of their actions on a faulty assumption about property boundaries, and now they were backtracking, though not as much as they should have. The letter didn't include an apology. It didn't offer compensation for the months of harassment I'd endured or the legal fees I'd racked up defending myself. Instead, it simply stated that the HOA would discontinue further enforcement actions against me. That was it. No acknowledgement of their trespassing, their baseless complaints, or the stress they'd caused me. Just a vague, half-hearted assurance that they'd leave me alone moving forward. It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. The stress had started to show in small ways. Shorter temper, restless nights, a general sense of unease that never quite went away. My girlfriend noticed, of course, and she did her best to support me, but I knew it was taking a toll on her too. It felt like the life we'd built together, the peaceful, happy life I'd worked so hard to protect, was slipping through my fingers. When the HOA backed off and finally admitted they had no claim over my property, I could have stopped there. I could have walked away, content to have my independence recognized, my land left untouched. But after everything they'd put me through, the stress, the harassment, the endless letters and threats, I couldn't just let it slide. This wasn't about the money or even revenge. It was about accountability. They needed to understand that their actions had consequences. And honestly, I needed closure. So my lawyer again and I prepared to sue the HOA for harassment, emotional distress, and reimbursement of my legal fees. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Lawsuits are expensive, time-consuming, and mentally draining. But my lawyer was confident. We had more than enough evidence. The trespassing incident, the baseless fines, the threatening letters, and the township's records that proved my property was never part of their jurisdiction. The case practically built itself. The HOA's legal team was quick to respond. They wanted to avoid litigation, which didn't surprise me. A public lawsuit would have been a PR nightmare for them. Their reputation was already shaky among residents, and a court battle would have only made things worse. We entered settlement negotiations, and while it wasn't easy, these people were stubborn. I refused to back down. My lawyer laid out everything in detail. The $3,200 in fines they'd falsely claimed, the hours of work I'd lost dealing with their harassment, the emotional toll it had taken on me and my relationship, the blatant trespassing incident. The HOA's attorneys squirmed, trying to argue that their actions were in good faith. But township records and security footage told a different story. Eventually, they realized they didn't have a leg to stand on. After weeks of back and forth, we reached an agreement. The HOA would pay me $18,000 in total damages, $3,200 to reimburse the invalid fines they tried to impose, $2,000 to cover my legal fees, $7,000 for emotional distress damages, $5,800 as compensation for lost time and opportunity costs. But that wasn't all. The settlement also required them to issue a formal written apology. I wasn't just looking for money. I wanted them to acknowledge what they'd done. The letter arrived a week later, signed by the HOA board, full of legalese and insincere regret. But I didn't care. It was proof that I'd won. When the settlement money hit my account, it wasn't the relief I expected. Sure, it felt good to finally have closure, but it also brought a strange kind of emptiness. The fight was over. For months, my life had revolved around this conflict, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I had space to think about what came next. That space gave me clarity. It reminded me of what really mattered. Not the HOA, not the property, but the people and dogs who made this house a home. My girlfriend had stood by me through all of it, even when the stress had gotten the better of me. And despite the mistakes I'd made in the past, she'd chosen to forgive me and rebuild what we had. I realized I didn't just want her in my life. I wanted her to be my life. So I started planning. There's a hiking trail near my property that we both love. It winds through the woods, up a gentle incline, and ends at a scenic overlook with a breathtaking view of the valley below. It's one of those places where time seems to slow down, where everything feels calm and infinite. I couldn't think of a better spot to ask her to marry me. The day of the proposal, I enlisted a couple of friends to help. They went up to the overlook early and set up string lights, a blanket, and a small table with champagne and glasses. I'd written a speech, nothing too formal, just a few heartfelt words about how much she meant to me and how excited I was about our future. The ring was tucked safely into my jacket pocket, burning a hole there the entire hike. When we reached the overlook, she stopped in her tracks. "What's all this?" she asked, her eyes wide as she took in the lights and the champagne. I smiled, took her hand, and led her to the blanket. As we stood there, with the valley stretching out below us and the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. For a moment, she just stared at me, her hands covering her mouth. Then she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Of course, yes." We stayed at the overlook for hours, drinking champagne and talking about our future. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. We got married 6 months later, in a small, intimate ceremony under the willow tree on my property. It was a perfect spring day, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that made the willow's branches sway like something out of a painting. We kept it simple, just close friends and family. No over-the-top decorations or elaborate catering. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about celebrating us. The dogs, of course, played a special role. They were dressed in little bow ties, and one of them carried the rings down the aisle in a small pouch attached to his collar. The guests loved it, and honestly I did too. Seeing them there, part of the day, reminded me of everything that had brought us to that moment. The reception was held in my backyard, with string lights crisscrossing overhead and tables set up under the open sky. We kept the menu simple: barbecue, fresh salads, and homemade pies, and spent the night laughing, dancing, and listening to heartfelt toasts from our friends and family. My best friend joked during his speech that I'd gone from fighting with an HOA to planning a wedding, and somehow I'd survived both. A few months after the wedding, we got the biggest surprise of all. It was during a family dinner at my house. We'd invited everyone over for a casual meal, burgers on the grill, cold beers in the cooler, and decided it was the perfect time to share our news. After everyone had finished eating, we handed out small gift boxes to each guest. Inside was a pair of baby shoes and a note that read, "Coming soon." For a moment, there was silence as everyone processed what they were seeing. Then the cheers started. My mom cried. My dad clapped me on the back so hard I almost spilled my drink. It was chaos, but the good kind. Over the next few months, we started preparing for our new chapter. The office upstairs, once my work sanctuary, was converted into a nursery, complete with a crib, a rocking chair, and a mural of a forest we painted together. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life will throw challenges at you when you least expect it. The key is to face them head-on, to fight for what's right, and to never lose sight of the things that make it all worthwhile.